Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad to see you. We're going to wait just a few seconds before we kick off, give some of our colleagues and friends a few moments to get logged in, get their hot beverage ready, get ready to go. We really are excited to have you here. We can't wait to share some of the insight that we have gained around data center migrations and migrations in general with two guys who are just brilliant. And I'll get started in just a little bit, but we're still welcoming some folks in. I see more people trickling in. Thank you so much for your patience. We really do appreciate it. You know, we said give them about 90 seconds. I think 90 seconds sounds good, so we've got about 20 more. Hope everyone is well and excited to learn about data center migration secrets. All right, let's go ahead and do it. Welcome everyone to the Data Center Best Practices Around Migration webinar. My name is Ryan Spilkin, and I am evangelist at Adaptavist. I'm just going to take a few seconds to go through some housekeeping before we get started and before I turn it over to Ryan and Will. First of all, we want to be transparent in this. Though Ryan and Will are on the call with us today, we will be watching a recorded presentation. This is to ensure that you get the most bang for your buck in terms of migration theory and practice. And then we're going to do question and answer afterwards. To get your questions answered, please, please, please send us a question in the questions box in GoToWebinar. That's in your GoToWebinar control panel. You'll see a questions area. Type your question in there, send it. We will take those questions and answer them live after the recording. If we run out of time, we are not going to leave you hanging. So if you ask a question that does not get answered, no stress. We will email you with a response and be happy to continue that conversation further. If there are technical troubles, please send in the chat window of GoToWebinar a message to our organizers. I want to take just a second to introduce those two. That is Adaptavist webinar expert and senior marketing manager Hugh Davey, and Rianne Muir, my colleague on the services marketing team, who assembled this entire webinar and arranged for Ryan and Will's time and just made this whole thing happen. So Hugh and Rianne are with us today, and they're going to be making sure that you are taken care of. And so, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan and Will for our data center migration best practices. Cheers, everyone.
Hello, welcome everyone to the Essential Data Center Migration Best Practice webinar with me, Will Davis, Managing Consultant from Adaptavist here in the UK.
Hey Will, and hey everyone. I'm Ryan Carney. I'm also a Managing Consultant. I'm based out of North America. I'm going to go through some best practices for migrating to data center.
So here's what we're going to cover today. We've got a few things to go through. We're going to talk about the reasons why you might want to migrate, the steps that you want to go to plan that migration, how you test your migration, and importantly, the people side of the migration process.
We're going to try and distill down some of the things that we've learned from the many migrations that we've done over the past several years.
We're going to talk a little bit about the tooling you might use, some of the technical concerns, how you actually go about executing your migration. It's not just about the technical side of things, so it's important to remember the people in your organization, the users of your tools. So alongside those technical tooling, we're also going to talk about the communication, how you bring everyone on board with your migration process.
Yeah, it can seem like a daunting task at first, but there are several steps that you can take to help ensure success. So let's start first with why migrate? This is an important question. I mean, it is a complex task and it can take some time, but there are benefits to it.
Yeah, so one of the key advantages of the data center platform is reducing the risk of your Atlassian toolset. There's a few ways it can do this. You might be an organization that's using a single Jira or Confluence server, or you might be, as we've seen many times, it's the usage within your organization has grown up organically, and you might actually have a few different Jiras and Confluence running alongside each other, where one team has picked up and another team has picked up, and so they've been working separately. So data center kind of has two key advantages. So if you're in that second scenario, certainly it's a more stable and scalable platform, and that really allows you to merge those instances together, get everyone on a common platform. But regardless of whether your organization is using multiple Jiras and Confluences together, even if you're just using a single instance of each, you can get a real advantage in reduction to risk out to moving to data center through its high availability. Essentially, you're clustering it onto multiple nodes, so the chance of downtime, all the nodes going down at once, is hugely reduced.
Yeah, and if you do run into an issue with one single node, all you really have to do is take that node out of the load balancer and troubleshoot it, or just break it down and rebuild it. And the users will never know. And so one of the other advantages is in reducing the cost and complexity. So not only do you get the increased performance and the decreased downtime due to the data center deployment, but whenever you migrate and merge instances that sometimes pop up across various companies, you can reduce the operational inefficiencies that you see. A lot of times you'll have people in the same essential function doing things two different ways. So they've reinvented the wheel. It's best to do things in one standard way, and moving into a data center deployment with best practices in mind can help you make that push to reduce the overall complexity and cost of managing those instances. So there's also a reduction in cost if you have multiple environments, because you can merge all of those disparate licenses into one single license. And you can also reduce the overhead and complexity of managing multiple environments from the back end and the front end. So reducing the times that you have to do upgrades across different environments, and reducing the amount of configuration that admins might have to do in order to make projects work.
So yeah, we've already touched on a little bit around the downtime reduction, the risk reduction. That's not really the only kind of advantage in that area data center brings. Certainly, as your organization grows, data center is far better equipped to deal with increased user counts, heavier usage, more integrations, more apps installed. And as you need to scale that ever larger, bringing on new nodes into your system really allows to increase the performance of your system efficiently with minimum disruption to the end users.
And as you become more sophisticated, and we're going to show you how to become more sophisticated with this, you'll be able to understand how many concurrent actions and how many users each node can support. So when do you need to add an additional node into your configuration, at what point? So we're going to talk about two things later on that are going to help you understand that.
So yeah, so we're going to talk about the benefits of Atlassian Data Center today, but let's just be aware that it's not a golden bullet that will solve all your problems. You don't have. It doesn't mean you forget about all the other best practices around administration, security, user training. All those sorts of things can be forgotten.
One thing you want to be really careful about is bringing forward errors or misconfigurations in your environment. So view this as a chance to get things right and follow best practices. We're going to talk about some of those in more detail a bit later on.
So our migration is a big project, and it's not one that you tend to do that often. So it's really, really crucial that you plan properly. And at the center of any plan, you need to
put the people first.
So here you're looking at a fine bunch of people. This is Adaptavist from all across the world gathered in one place. And if you look really carefully, you'll be able to see me and Ryan in this picture. But we're not going to tell you where exactly we are.
Yeah, so this is ultimately all about the people. It's the users that you're supporting here, and it's the users that you're going to have to put first in all of your planning.
Now, there are two ways of approaching a migration project like this. And I think me and Ryan, we both have our preferred options here. So I'm a big fan of doing things, breaking them up, doing things in bite-sized chunks. It might take a little bit longer overall, but you reduce the risk. You reduce the amount of risk, the amount of downtime with each chunk.
Yeah, and I'm more of a fan of doing things all at once, or the Big Bang approach, because I really just want to migrate once.
Let's be clear, though, I think both have their advantages. The most important thing is understanding what's the right option for your business, for your situation that you're in. Certainly, if you're on a smaller scale, you've only got a single instance that you're moving to data center, I'd probably recommend the Big Bang approach all the same.
And I think the most important thing here is to recognize what level of downtime is acceptable for your business, and then kind of go from there. There are workarounds to a hard downtime. For instance, you might be able to make your source instance that you're abandoning read-only during the migration process, but at some point you're going to need a little bit of downtime to ensure that you have a clean cutover for your data.
So I think the first thing you need to do when you're planning is you need to know what exactly it is you're going to migrate. It's a good opportunity to get your house in order. That's key looking at. Do you really need this add-on? Is this integration with another system really essential? Is the infrastructure set up as well as it could be?
Yeah, this is a great chance to reevaluate how your instance is hosted and what specific configurations you have on your instance as well. And certainly for moving to data center, there are changes to how the application works, such as adding in cache synchronization, potentially adding in multiple nodes. All of these things you're going to want to consider of how that affects your environment.
It's also important, especially if you're doing if you're merging multiple instances together, to think about your destination environment, the targets. So you need to think not just about the infrastructure that you're going to use, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the infrastructure you might use for a data center in a bit, but also think about things like the users. Where are my users coming from? Am I bringing multiple users together? Will there be duplicates? Which plugins are the right ones to use? Especially if you might have several that achieve the same results.
Yeah, and a point here to people, you're going to have to train them in the upcoming differences that are going to happen in their environment. Maybe you're moving to a new version, maybe if you're merging instances, maybe some configuration's been duplicated and now you have to choose one configuration that's going to win. All of those things you need to have alignment on before you actually pull the trigger. That way users aren't surprised.
It's also a good opportunity to have, as I say, get your house in order, have a bit of a clean up. I think anyone who's used Jira, especially for a long time, will know that Jira tend to accumulate, custom fields and workflows and projects, things that tests that were never completed, but somehow never got deleted either. And it's a good opportunity to rationalize your instance. Don't take all that rubbish with you. And it's certainly of advantage to the migration project itself. You don't want to be taking a load of rubbish in your environment, even more so if it makes the migration harder.
Yeah, every little bit that you can clean up prior to actually migrating is going to help reduce the complexity and risk to the migration itself. All of these things are stored in the JVM, so it also requires less resources going forward and makes you have a more efficient environment from the infrastructure side, as well as operationally. So your admins don't have to deal with the duplicated configuration or things that have the same base function but have different names in your environment. And yeah, there's additional tools that are going to be available to you in your new data center environment. There's changes to how indexing works. In the UI, you can even copy an index from one node to the other. What I spoke about earlier, as far as understanding how many concurrent operations each node can allow you to have, that's going to be brought to you by the automated load testing called JPT, which stands for Jira Performance Testing. This has recently been released by Atlassian, and it's a great tool that you can use to simulate load on your servers. Then you can combine that with the Access Log Analyzer that Atlassian has also released recently. And the Access Log Analyzer is going to give you a visual breakdown as well as some statistics about how your environment is performing. It's going to tell you how long, for instance, boards take to load. It's going to give you aggregate response times over time. And it's really going to let you see how your new configuration works from a load perspective. And then, of course, once you migrate, it's best practices to just run these other tools like the log analyzer and the integrity check.
So infrastructure is a key technical concern when you're looking at moving to data center. What you're looking at here is a sort of fairly straightforward recommended data center setup in AWS, and it's got the key things that you need to think about. You don't need to be using AWS to use data center. You can use other cloud providers. You can use your own infrastructure, but you've got to be aware of the key factors here. You need a load balancer which sits in front of everything. You need individual nodes that provide the Jira application. Underneath those, you need a database of some kind. And one other difference from Atlassian Data Center to Atlassian Server, for those who are aware of the server infrastructure, is you now have a shared home, which needs to be a shared storage, so represented here by the NAT instances. But it doesn't matter what your infrastructure is actually going to look like. The most important thing is to know what it's going to be before you start migrating.
Also, make note that depending on what application you're going to use, there's going to be differences between how you're going to want to set up the infrastructure. For instance, on Bitbucket, you're going to want a NFS storage, as that's the only supported storage. And you may want to consider having your own Elasticsearch nodes. For Confluence, you may want to put Synchrony on their own nodes outside of the Confluence applications, etc.
Yeah. We haven't mentioned Bitbucket much, but you can also look at things like smart mirrors if you've got a highly distributed team to improve the performance for people who are further away from the central hosting location.
That's a good note. And actually, for Jira, they just released CDNs. So if you have a globally distributed team, you can have essentially the equivalent of that smart mirroring that Will mentioned in the other applications as well.
So coming back to people, we've always found that one of the most crucial factors in the success of a data center migration is the user acceptance testing. And it's something I think people feel like they can get away without, but we really think that's just setting yourself up for disaster.
Yeah, this is something you definitely don't want to skip. I mean, no one knows your data better than your users, and it's going to be really important for them to find things and be as thorough as possible in order to minimize the risk whenever you move to production.
So an important place to start is make sure you have some sort of a test or staging environments that you can migrate to initially, and then let your users at that to do their tests before you migrate the production data.
Yeah, you're going to, depending on what teams you have working in your tools, you're going to want a representative that knows each team and how they work to test out the environment. As many varieties of roles as you can get at different levels is the best case scenario when it comes to your UAT. And also plan to have them document what they're testing so that if you have other people come in and test, that they're not duplicating that same effort. And so that whenever you do run into issues, you can have a way to track progress on them.
So yeah, in terms of testing, I mean, we think it's crucial to success. So make sure you start it early in the process, even if it's just the planning. Make sure you've got someone who takes responsibility for that testing overall. Making sure anyone who's going to be affected by the migration is looped in, and start early, but keep testing going throughout the process as much as possible.
Yeah, and a lot of times a move to data center includes apps that potentially are no longer compatible, or you have to make a change to how something works, or there's an upgrade involved in that process whenever you do make that move. So it's important to keep a log of all of these changes and create communication that's going to be coherent and concise for the users whenever you do have to communicate those changes to them.
As we said, it's really important to include people from all the teams affected by the migration. You don't want to think you've got a successful migration to production and then find out that one team's project just isn't working the way they need it to anymore. So it's and a good way of making sure you're involving everyone involved is getting an agreement around what the overall scope of the migration is. Which projects, which spaces, which data is being migrated, and you can use that to map who should be testing, and then from that you can define who the UAT leads should be for each of those areas defined.
And here's a quote from our very own Trevor James, the head of managed services here at Adaptavist.
An all-round great guy.
Nobody knows your data as your users do. They'll be the first to notice if something isn't quite right, and that really is true. It's a lot easier to iterate on these changes in a staging environment rather than try and figure out how to solve them whenever you've gone live in production.
Test and test again. Once your users have done their first set of tests and you spotted some issues and you fixed them, don't assume that you've hit success at that point. Give them the fix, just let them get back into the instance. Chances are there'll be some things they didn't spot before. Think the bigger problems tend to hide smaller problems, and it's only by repeating this testing stage that you can really be sure that you capture the issues.
Yeah, make sure you thoroughly document every fix.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the tooling that you can use for migrating to data center. And I'll be clear that we're talking primarily here about tools when you're merging multiple instances. If you're migrating just one server to data center, really your main concern is the infrastructure. You don't necessarily need to actually physically migrate data from one instance to another.
If you're moving to a different environment, though, completely different infrastructure, you have two real options if you're not merging, and that's a database dump and restore and the XML backup and restore. But let's get into these tools that are going to help with the more complex process of merging data.
So yeah, there's Project Configurator for Jira. Now this is an app that we produce at Adaptavist, and it's not just for migrating data, it's there to help you support managing your configuration across your Jira instance in all sorts of ways. But we found it's really useful for migrating data. It allows you to export complex configurations alongside the XML data and attachments, and restore that into other Jira instances without overwriting any existing data. One thing that the out-of-the-box Atlassian tool does not provide.
Yeah, so if you don't use a tool like Project Configurator, you're going to have to go with a CSV migration to merge your data. And with a CSV, since it is a flat file, you're going to be losing things like comments, history, and attachments. And sometimes that's just not acceptable.
One other alternative, though, if you can't use Project Configurator or similar apps, but CSV isn't rich enough, is we've had some success using the JSON import. Now, there's a lot more complex to build a JSON import than a CSV import, but it does allow you to import richer data.
And so both of those options were for Jira, but we want to give a quick shout out to Bob Swift's CLI tool for Confluence. That can help automate the merging of multiple Confluence spaces or pages together.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning Confluence allows you to import space by space without overwriting any data. But again, when you're looking at very large Confluence moves where you might have hundreds or even thousands of spaces, you really want to put some kind of automation in place to help you deal with that. And the Bob Swift CLI tool is great for that.
All right, the other thing to consider whenever you're migrating is the add-on or app data. You're going to have to take into effect any differences between how those applications work from the server deployment to the data center deployment. Sometimes there are additional features as well. For instance, if you're using React Insight, there's the option to have a dedicated node for API traffic. You can also consider that an upgrade may be a part of this, and you may need to move to different versions of your add-ons as well. Those are going to create, again, different features, potentially a different UI for your users, and maybe even some changes in how those apps fundamentally work.
One of the things, especially if you're merging instances, is that you'll probably need to do some version leveling, not just in Jira and Confluence, but also the apps that can really help the migration go smoothly if everything's on the same version. It's also worth checking out each of the apps that you're migrating, just to look at what sort of migration paths they support. Some apps, like ALM Work Structure, that has its own built-in export, import tool that you can use. Others are supported directly by tools like Project Configurator, and others you might need to look at making some custom tooling, or even look at the manual migration of data to support in the process.
Yeah, and that's a great time to consider whenever you might want to potentially get rid of some apps, or if you're finding that there's duplicate functionality between some apps, you might have to try and create a custom migration process to get one application's data into the other. So again, a great time to review what's necessary from an operational perspective.
It's good also to think at this stage around the integrations that your Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket are using. Again, if you're moving to new infrastructure, you need to consider the network conditions. Can I connect to that source code tool, to that build tool that I'm using from the new location? If I'm merging instances, am I integrated with multiple tools that do the same job? Can I consolidate some of those? Just make sure you thought about these and include those steps in your migration process.
So it can be pretty daunting to have to try and make all of these decisions, and that's really where communication becomes critical. Here you're going to want to get input from your stakeholders, whether it's at the project level, the people that are really going to be utilizing certain add-ons, or the network team, the infrastructure team, people that are going to have to decide if there's security requirements you're going to have to account for if you're moving to a new environment. So again, it's really important to understand how each integration works, and your stakeholders are going to be critical for that.
Absolutely, and I say the people who use the tools are the ones who are really going to define whether your migration is successful or not. Really, all communication should be focused on them and their needs, giving them the information they need, and avoiding unnecessary technical detail.
I think going back to that concise and coherent communication that you want to have, make sure that you take advantage of all of the tools in your organization in order to enhance the visibility of what exactly is changing and what the team is doing during this migration. So if you have Slack, Teams, email, Confluence pages, make sure that you can tie them all together in a coherent way.
And make sure you're using the right tools to reach the right people in your organization. You know, across different organizations, we find that people tend to use different tools. Different departments have their own favorite method of communication. You know, some people live in email, so some people are allergic to their inbox, and you'll need to be on Slack to get hold of them.
Yeah, so just like there's not one migration that's going to work for everyone, there's not one plan for communication that's going to fit everyone. So make sure that you're adapting to the specific needs of your organizations. That's really going to help you make sure that there's no surprises. Make sure that you plan as much as you can out ahead of time with the stakeholders. It's really going to be them that helps drive the success of this project, because they're the one that's going to care about what's changed at the end of the day and what this new environment is going to look like.
And a way you can make sure this is all achieved is by making it part of your plan. You know, don't just plan around the technical steps you're making. Make sure your plan includes what communications you need to make, when you need to make them, who needs to be the target of them, how are you going to communicate. So then, yes, well, then once you have your plan, it should be time to actually make the move.
So one of the most important things is to have a run book. This is going to be an area where you've documented the exact steps you're going to take. You want this to be as simple as possible. So I prefer a largely cut and paste migration where everything that you've got in your run book is going to be duplicated exactly in your new environment, and there's going to be no surprises. Typically, you have to go through a few iterations in order to achieve a run book that you're really satisfied with, that has a low level of risk. One little trick that I like is to have someone who has been unfamiliar with the process run through your run book and test it. It's essentially peer review for your code and for your process, and that really helps to ensure that you're not making any assumptions or having any gotchas in that run book that you might have overlooked as you were building it.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that point. It's really, when you're making your production, moving your production data, you really want to make sure that you're not having to solve problems at that point in the process. On the use of run books, it doesn't matter how much you're automating the process. It's if it's largely scripted or used as other automation tooling, you really want to capture how all the human processes that are involved to execute from start to finish.
Yeah, so it makes a lot of sense to put the actual scripts in your runbook as well. If you're going to show in the runbook that you're executing those, just put the contents in there as well so that anyone can understand exactly what's going on. Once you've got this completed runbook, it can help give you an overall sense of time for exactly how long this whole process is going to take, and that's critical when determining your downtime. All right, so you're also going to want to consider a potential rollback scenario. Maybe something doesn't go right during your go live, and you're going to have to understand, what does something not going right look like? What is going to have to happen? Who's going to do it and when? For instance, are we going to have to swap DNS in order to roll back? Did we have to make any changes to the environment, like the SSL certs or any configuration in your proxy? What changes are we going to have to make to the database? All of these things are going to be critical whenever you consider what a rollback plan looks like.
One trick I like to use is just take advantage of any existing backup and restore processes you have. I hope you'll have some kind of security on your Atlassian tools, something to help make sure you don't lose data when servers go down. That doesn't hit productivity, and if you've already got that stuff, make use of it. Don't reinvent the wheel.
So you're going to have to know exactly how long your rollback process is going to take. Make sure that you also understand the consequences of that. Are people going to have a grease time where their DNS is a little bit out of whack? What team members are going to be involved? Can one single person do all of this, or are we going to need multiple people? Are we going to have to account for changes in the SSO tool that we're using? And make sure that okay, we have this downtime window, and if we're not ready to go by, let's say, an hour before the first users get back on, then we're going to start the rollback process. And that's why it's critical to know exactly how long that process is going to take.
Yeah, I think that's a key point of recognizing if when things aren't going so well, when's the time to roll back, take that step back, and look at what went wrong, learn from it, and improve, so you can come back and take another go at it. One thing that sometimes gets missed in plans is that shortly after even a successful migration, you may find that you have a period of increased support requirements. People, even a fairly straightforward migration, people will be working in a new environment. They might be working with a slightly different set of apps. Even the rationalization that you might have done as part of the migration might have led to minor changes. And people tend to respond to this by contacting the support.
Yeah, even if something's not wrong, things still might look differently or work differently, and there's sure to be questions. So make sure that you have some sort of communication channel open, whether it's Slack or email or a Confluence page, something like that, where you can document some of those questions that people are asking, help prevent them from asking again in the future, as well as ensure them that if there are changes to how they're working, that there are also ways that you can assist them in getting back to a happy place or a comfortable place with what they were doing before.
And it's always a good simple courtesy to let the support teams know about what you're doing. There may be more stuff coming their way as a result. So yeah, so investing the time to plan the process beforehand is really crucial here. So this is a process that overall probably won't be executed that many times. Hopefully you're not moving back and forward between different infrastructure for your tools too often. So it's not something you'll have a lot of practical experience necessarily with. And really just taking that time to plan, it really just saves you time in the long run than having to deal with small issues ongoingly, users who are upset and reduce productivity and obviously angry managers as a result.
Yeah, once you go live, your environment's going to be different than the environment that you were doing your testing in. So it's best to get all your iterations out of the way in that test or stage environment, rather than having to work out of a perpetually changing production environment where the risk is a lot higher. So really patience is key here, as well as being as thorough as possible. Make sure that you've got a process that you feel comfortable with and that you know the risk is as low as you can get it. Well, with that said, I think you're ready to start a migration and enjoy your new awesome data center environment. All right, so thanks so much. We hope you're successful in your migration efforts. And to further help your success, go ahead and download the ebook that we've got on adaptavist.com for deeper technical information and more advice. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Will.
And thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
All right, everyone, that is the bulk of the presentation, but we've got some question and answer time, and we're happy to hear from you. If you haven't asked your question yet, don't be afraid to submit it to the chat, the question window, or in the chat. Either way, we want to get it answered for you. And we want to start with a question from Darren. And Darren asks, a question on load testing, defining test parameters. How can we get an accurate picture of exactly where our load is coming from? Actual requests made by users. So Will and Ryan are joining us and what do you guys think?
Great question. There's actually a few ways you can go about this, depending on what what the tools you have available to you and the depth of information you want. Probably the simplest and most straightforward way of getting this information is actually to use the Jira Access Log Analyzer. You should be able to find a bit more information on this with a simple Google search, but that effectively is a simple Java tool that runs against your access logs, and that will give you an output of fairly simple compared to some other ways, but an output of what a lot of the typical requests are made, and use that as the starting point, kind of your profile for load testing to make sure you're concentrating your tests on the right area.
Yeah, and that's the most simple and straightforward way. But if you have other tools available, like an Elk Stack or Splunk or something like that, then that's another way to go ahead and get that information, where you can tie response times to specific user actions.
Nice, guys. Another question came in, and that is, how long before migration do we need to start planning?
I'll take this one, if you don't mind. It really depends, I guess, on the size of your data set. You're probably going to have to do a few test runs beforehand, but certainly I'd give yourself a few months really scaling up to 6 months if you're looking at the largest data set, or maybe even beyond. So if we're talking sort of, if you're looking at the tens of thousands of issues across hundreds of projects potentially, lots of apps, then yeah, up to 6 months ahead might not be a bad idea.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And again, it depends on the number of instances that you're moving or merging. And it also depends on the individual complexity. Like Will said, how many apps are installed on them? How much custom configuration do you have?
Nice. Thanks, guys. That sounds good. And of course, if we can clarify any of these questions further, or if there's any more information you want to know, please don't hesitate. Throw it in the chat box. Another question has come in, and that is, one of the things we need to know is about NFS. On your diagram, it showed us 2 different NFS setup. Are they both active or active cold? That's from Luke. Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that we touched on this a little bit. So you're going to want an NFS mounted on a VM, or there's even services that can be given by third-party providers. I won't name any specific brands, not to show any favoritism, but there are essentially managed NFS solutions out there. That's going to be critical for strictly Bitbucket. If you're able to move to AWS or Azure, it's going to be better to use some of the cloud native options that are provided, like the Azure storage accounts. Those are going to be more simple and have more redundancy options. But in general, you don't want a single point of failure. So if you are going to set up an NFS VM, you're going to want it replicating in a hot-cold way rather than a hot-hot way. Now, in the later versions of Jira, where caching is important, they've moved the caches to the individual nodes so that they're served locally. So you're not taking such a big hit on the bottleneck where, you're not taking such a big hit where NFS is your bottleneck to where you'd want a load balancer and hot replication on the NFS volumes.
Great. Guys, we have a follow-up from Darren. Follow-up question on load testing one more time. Does running that tool against the production instance have any risk to in-running performance? Should I switch on any additional logging? Good question, Darren.
Yeah, really good question. Oh, go ahead, Will.
Oh, so sorry there. Yeah, I was just going to say, the tool itself doesn't run. It's a separate tool that runs separate to Jira, so you can extract the logs you run it against and not run it in your production environment. In terms of additional logging, the more logging you have on, the better. But that does actually that may have an impact on your production environment. So if you have any testing environment or anything like that, or if you want to switch on for a short period of time, maybe warn users of potential degraded performance just for the purpose of testing, that's probably a good idea.
That tool is going to produce an HTML file that will load in your browser and provide you with the statistics and visualizations around the usage of your environment. It's going to tie response times to individual actions. So that should provide you with what you need. And again, you can use this on logs going backwards in times as well, and analyze if usage has changed over time, or is it different on different parts of the day, different times of the day. You can answer all those questions.
I hope that resolves the question there, Darren. Please feel free to keep them coming. We do like hearing Will and Ryan go in on this topic because they are brilliant. We have another question, and that is, how long? Excuse me. Can you tell us about some of the main reasons that clients have come to us requesting to move to data center? So the main reasons that people move to data center.
Yeah. So
Brian, you go ahead this one time. Yeah.
Well, I'll pass it over to you. I was going to say the two most obvious reasons that I see are one for performance, where they've scaled up their environment to the point where they're running into performance issues. A note on that one is that I think it's generally best to do some investigation on those performance issues beforehand so that you're not bringing them into a more complex environment with multiple nodes where it can be harder to troubleshoot. Two is uptime. So typically this scales up, or Jira scales up to be a tool that's critical for the enterprise. Maybe they have a global team, or maybe it's just that it's that important due to various automations that the tool remain up all the time. So once it becomes that critical, the difference between 99% uptime and 99.9% uptime becomes a very important issue for a client. And that is one scenario that often causes the move as well.
I'd just add to that as well. One scenario I've seen a lot is consolidation. We talked about it a fair amount before, but Jira, a lot of its early growth was quite organic. A lot of teams within an organisation start their own Jira up. The typical server onto a desk running situation. It grows. It's a really useful tool. It grows to the point it becomes mission critical along with Confluence. At that point, the business needs to get serious about it. They need to think about centralizing it. All those things Ryan just talked about, ensuring the uptime, but also it becomes impractical to be running multiple separate instances alongside each other. So yeah, bringing them all into one place is one of the biggest reasons I've seen that people have moved to Data Center as well.
Another benefit that we have seen from people moving to Data Center is the consolidation of costs. When you've got multiple Jira instances running the same add-ons, there's oftentimes a cost saving of bringing that all together. But I want to point out to everyone on the webinar today that all of this information and way more is available through our ebook on data center migration, which we've just shared in the chat, a link to download that ebook, which contains really deep dives on a lot of the topics that we covered today and gets pretty technical. So please feel free to download that from the link. We've got a follow-up question from Luke. Does Adaptavist offer consultancy for setting up load testing and any subsequent setups of data center for businesses? If so, do we have costings for that? Well, Luke, yeah, the answer is absolutely, and we will be happy to connect you with one of our client account representatives to discuss those options. Will and Ryan are both consultants who are veterans in the field of doing just that kind of work, and we have a whole team of brilliant people that work with them to ensure that our migrations and all of our processes and systems around data center are working at the highest efficiency. So thanks for asking that, Luke. We absolutely are open for business. If you have any further questions, please hit us up. We are out of questions at the moment. But Ryan, Will, anything else that you think that could add a little value to our listeners before we wrap up the call?
Maybe one note on load testing is that while we mentioned Jira performance tests in the webinar, we didn't mention that there's going to be a need to use other tools for the other applications. So for Bitbucket, in the past, we've used JMeter, and we've created some custom scripts to perform Git operations. As I think typically the performance impact that you're seeing in Git at scale is around the different Git operations that are applied. And that's where network bandwidth and all of these other things that are a bit obtuse in AWS or Azure become more important to test out, as well as getting the information like your IO and whatnot. So you have to use a different tool depending on the application sometimes. Jira is the only one that has that nice prepackaged JPT, and here at Adaptavist, we've actually modified that jar file that Atlassian ships in order to iron out some of the problems that we've seen with it, such as it uses Chrome drivers in order to create HTTP sessions for load testing, and sometimes those Chrome drivers get out of date. So we have our own tools that we just update internally. That's one note I'd make about those. they do take a little bit of tweaking sometimes.
Yeah, and similarly, we produce some of our own tooling for example, testing Confluence and Bitbucket, as Ryan talked about with Git. Obviously, the Atlassian tools, unfortunately, are focused a bit more on Jira than the others.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Please download the ebook from the link that we have up on screen now or in the chat of GoToWebinar. And if you'd like to speak with Adaptavist further, just head on over to adaptavist.com and drop us a line. For you, Rianne, Will, and Ryan, I'm Ryan, and thank you so much for being with us today. We'll catch you on the next webinar.